Just a few minutes, that's all it took for President Ibrahim Traoré to go from a quiet traveler to a handcuffed suspect, because of nothing more than the color of his skin. No questions, no ID check, just judgment. But then, one rookie officer did a simple search, and everything changed. If this could happen to a president, what chance does an ordinary man have? Stay with us. This story will stay with you long after it ends. It began on an unremarkable morning. The sky was a dull, indecisive gray, neither raining nor clear, just heavy. Inside the international terminal, the usual airport noise had faded into an eerie quiet. No screaming children, no bustling tourists, just the low hum of air vents and the occasional clatter of suitcase wheels on polished marble. And walking through that quiet was a man alone. No entourage, no suit, no national flag pin. No one whispered his name. Yet he was Ibrahim Traoré, the president of Burkina Faso. Today, none of that mattered. Today, he wasn't a leader, he wasn't a symbol. He was just a man, wearing a plain jacket, jeans, and worn shoes. The kind of man you'd pass without a second thought. And for the first time in years, that's exactly what he wanted. No press, no cameras, no guards. This was a personal visit, off the record. His cousin Aisha had just given birth to triplets after years of heartbreak, and he wanted to surprise her, not as a president, but as family. Just 2 days, that's all he asked for. 2 days to breathe, without protocol, without expectation. As he passed immigration and stepped into the arrival hall, no one even glanced at him. He smiled faintly. Perfect, he thought. Let me be invisible. But he was about to learn something. Invisibility is not the same as freedom. There was a tension building inside him. Quiet, familiar. It wasn't fear. It was older than fear. It was the feeling of being seen for the wrong reasons, watched, judged, not for who you are, but for what you look like. He walked past luxury boutiques and glassy storefronts. The air smelled like expensive perfume. A man in uniform held his gaze too long. A woman clutched her purse a little tighter. A child stared until his mother pulled him close and whispered something he couldn't hear. He said nothing. He reminded himself, this isn't my country. These aren't my people. I'm not here to fix anything. He just needed to rest. A yellow taxi rolled up, dented, faded. The driver leaned out. Where to? Ibrahim hesitated. His phone was dead. The address was saved there. He didn't want to explain too much. Take me to the estates, he said softly. I'll find the house. The driver nodded, and the cab pulled away from the airport. Ibrahim sat back, watching the city pass in quiet smears. There was a strange kind of peace in anonymity, even if it felt like it could vanish at any moment. He thought, if I'm just a man now, let's see how the world treats me. For a while, everything was calm. The ride was silent. The sun peeked through the clouds. The street slowly filled with life. And Ibrahim allowed himself to believe this day would go exactly as he imagined. Quiet, warm, human. But then, it unraveled. About 25 minutes in, as the taxi entered a polished suburb with white villas and spotless lawns, he reached into his pocket to check the address his aide had printed. Gone. He searched the other pocket. Nothing. Then his chest tightened. He took out his phone and tapped the screen. Dead. No battery, no way to call, no address, no names. Just the estates. The cab rolled slowly past manicured hedges and soulless mansions. The place felt frozen, designed to impress, not to live in. Everything looked perfect, too perfect, like a showroom for a life no one actually lived. He smiled politely. Family's nearby. I'll walk. He paid in cash. The cab pulled away from the airport, and Ibrahim stood on the pristine pavement, surrounded by silence and symmetry. Nothing felt familiar. He walked slowly, looking, listening, searching. Red mailbox? White roses? A two-story house, or was it three? He turned corners, doubled back, tried to remember details from a video call 2 weeks ago. The smells Aisha used to fill her kitchen with, a sound, a tree, anything. But nothing felt like home. The houses stared blankly back at him, cold, expensive, indistinguishable. 15 minutes passed, still lost, still alone. And that's when everything took a darker turn. The situation had become surreal. Here he was, a sitting president, wandering the streets of a wealthy foreign suburb like a misplaced tourist. But even tourists carried working phones. He kept walking, trying to stay calm, but a strange realization crept in. There was no life outside these perfect homes, no children playing, no joggers, no dog walkers, not even the hum of a lawnmower, just silence, and houses lined up like silent jurors behind white fences and manicured hedges. It felt less like a neighborhood and more like a polished stage set, elegant, but hollow. And he, the outsider, didn't belong in the scene. Still, he kept moving. Eventually, he stopped in front of a house, white fence, flowers along the porch. There was something faintly familiar about it, maybe from the video call with Aisha, or maybe he just needed it to feel right. He stood there for a moment, hesitating, then took a breath and rang the bell. The faint scent of trimmed lavender lingered in the air. The house was pristine, white siding, gold house numbers nailed neatly above the door. One of the curtains shifted, as if someone had peeked through.
Standing behind it was a woman, early 60s maybe, with short gray hair and eyes that sharpened the moment they landed on him. Her posture stiffened, arms crossed. There was no welcome in her face, just suspicion. "Yes?" she asked, voice clipped. Ibrahim gave a warm, practiced smile, one he'd used in press conferences and peace negotiations. "Good afternoon, ma'am. I'm sorry to bother you. I'm visiting my cousin. She lives somewhere in this area. She just gave birth to triplets, and I came to surprise her, but my phone's dead, and I think I left the address at the hotel. I was hoping—" He didn't get to finish. Her frown deepened. She stepped onto the porch, arms folding tighter. Her tone sharpened. "What are you doing here?" Her voice wasn't just cold, it was confrontational. "This is a private neighborhood. People like you don't just walk around here." He froze, not out of confusion, but out of hope. Hope that he'd misheard. "I'm just trying to find her house," he said gently. "I promise I mean no harm." "Don't act innocent," she snapped. "I know your kind. You come around to see which houses are empty, then things go missing." He blinked, steadying himself. "Ma'am, that's not— I should call the police." His pulse spiked, not from fear, but a deep, weary frustration. He kept his hands visible, his posture calm. "I understand your concern," he said softly. "If I could just call my cousin, she'll—" "You think I'm giving you my phone?" she barked. "You'd run off with it. I said, leave now before I make this worse for you." The words landed like a slap. He had stood before dictators and defended his nation on global stages. He had fought for the dignity of his people. Yet here, on the steps of a suburban house, stripped of title and power, he was just a man with dark skin and no explanation good enough. "I'm not here to cause any trouble," he repeated. But she was already turning, already dialing. He stood motionless, as if the air had thickened around him. The door had never really been open. And as she shouted into the phone, something shifted in him. Not fear, not even anger, but something heavier, a quiet ache, a truth he had hoped he wouldn't have to face today. Even without power, or maybe especially without it, the world still refuses to see the man behind the color. "You people don't belong here." She didn't whisper it. She said it with clarity, with confidence, the kind of hate that doesn't shake or apologize. The words echoed. Not "you don't belong," but "you people." And suddenly, the quiet neighborhood wasn't so quiet anymore. Curtains twitched. A door across the street opened halfway. Somewhere a dog barked and fell silent again. They were watching, not intervening, just watching. Some curious, some cautious, and maybe some quietly satisfied. Not neighbors, witnesses, or accomplices. Ibrahim's gaze flicked around. He stood tall, composed, but inside his mind raced. This wasn't fear. This wasn't personal. It was older than both of them. Something ingrained, systemic. She didn't see a lost man looking for his cousin. She saw a threat. He tried again. "I really am just trying to visit family, that's all. Just 1 minute with your phone." She cut him off, louder this time, as if she wanted the entire block to hear. "No, I don't want your excuses. I don't care who you're pretending to be. I know what this is. You people scout neighborhoods like this and then things disappear. Not here, not today." He took a slow step back. Hands still at his sides, still visible, still unthreatening. Every movement now felt like it needed permission. "Please," he said quietly, "you don't understand." "I understand enough," she spat. "You show up dressed like that, talking polite like that makes you safe. But it doesn't. This is a neighborhood for decent people." The message was clear. Not you. Never you. He stood there, feeling the invisible chains tighten, centuries old and still intact. The further he got from power, the more fragile his dignity became in the eyes of those who never saw it in the first place. And then she turned toward the hallway, shouting louder, emboldened, "I'm calling the police." And this time, she meant it. He heard the sirens before he saw the cars. 2 sharp bursts cutting through the still air like glass shattering. Blue and red lights sliced across the hedges, fences, and walls. 2 police cars screeched to a halt in front of the house. Doors flung open. 2 white officers, both women, emerged fast, hands near their belts, eyes locked onto him. Not with curiosity, with suspicion. And just like that, the story was no longer his to tell. They moved like clockwork, quick, coordinated, decisive. But they didn't approach the woman standing firmly on her porch. They headed straight for the man on the sidewalk. "There he is," she called out, finger pointed like a trigger. "That's him. He's been wandering the neighborhood knocking on doors. I told him to leave, but he wouldn't. I don't feel safe." Those 4 words changed everything. I don't feel safe. Ibrahim saw it immediately, the shift in their eyes. That phrase was the spark. It didn't matter what he had said. It didn't matter that he had explained himself. She had played the one card she knew would work. Fear. One of the officers barked, "Do you live here?" "No," he answered, calmly raising one hand slightly. "I'm visiting." "Visiting who?" the second officer snapped, tone clipped, eyes narrowing. "My cousin," he said, steady but careful. "She just gave birth to triplets. I came to surprise her. My phone died, and I lost the address. I've been trying to—" "Do you have identification?" The first officer interrupted sharply. "Yes," he nodded. slowly moving his hand toward his jacket. "It's in my—" "Stop!" the second officer yelled. "Don't reach for anything!" He froze, arms midair, eyes forward. "It's just my ID," he said, softly, trying to de-escalate. But the air was already thick with suspicion. Reason didn't matter anymore. "Hands where we can see them," the officer shouted. He lifted them high, wide, fingers spread. "I'm not a threat," he said, mostly to himself now. "I just wanted help." But help wasn't what they brought. The second officer stepped behind him, gripped one wrist, then the other. Cold steel bit into his skin. The click of the cuffs was louder than the sirens. It wasn't just restraint, it was judgment. The neighborhood didn't need proof anymore. The police had made their decision. As they walked him toward the cruiser, the woman watched from her porch, arms folded, mouth curled in smug satisfaction. "Serves him right," she muttered loud enough for everyone to hear. Ibrahim didn't resist. What would have been the point? He had explained everything, calmly, respectfully, truthfully, but none of it mattered. Not to her, not to them, not to the neighbors peering from behind blinds. To them, he wasn't a president, not a visitor, not even a man. He was a problem. And in a place like this, a problem didn't need to be proven. It just needed to be feared. The cuffs pressed deeper into his wrists, cold, tight, mechanical. His back was straight, his hands behind him like a warning sign. He stood at the edge of a perfect sidewalk, in a perfect neighborhood, exposed and stripped of everything but breath. He stayed silent, not from guilt, but because he understood now. Anything he said could be twisted. Even his calm could be used against him. Silence had become his only shield. The woman on the porch stood tall, chin raised slightly as if awaiting applause. Her eyes flicked toward the windows across the street, confirming her audience was still watching. The show was complete. She had played her part perfectly, the vigilant protector of peace. The bitter irony lodged deep in her chest. She didn't know who he was, and yet she had already decided what he was. As one officer guided him forward, a thought thundered in his mind. If this is what happens when I say nothing, what would have happened if I spoke? If he had pushed back, raised his voice, asked why, defended his dignity, would they have drawn weapons, thrown him to the ground, justified something more permanent? They passed flower beds and polished driveways. Every house was identical, every window a frame for someone else's fear. And he had become exactly what they expected. The cruiser door opened. The smell of old vinyl and bleach drifted out. He was pushed inside. The door shut with a dull, final thud. Outside, the neighborhood returned to silence. The wind moved through trimmed hedges. A sprinkler hissed to life. It was as if nothing had happened, as if removing him had restored the order. Inside the car, the officers said little. One typed notes into a tablet, the other stared at the road. Ibrahim sat straight, eyes fixed on the blur of suburban perfection passing by. His heart was steady, but heavy in a way no title could protect. This wasn't embarrassment. This wasn't insult. This was older, deeper. He leaned his head against the window, eyes unfocused, and whispered to no one, "If this is me, what happens to those without a name?" He thought of the young men who had never worn presidential sashes, never stood behind microphones, never had cameras waiting to hear their version. The ones who vanished without a headline. The ones no one asked about. He closed his eyes, breathing deep. He thought of Aisha, of the triplets, of the moment he had dreamed of, knocking at the door, arms full of gifts. Now he would arrive late, without a smile, without flowers, just red marks on his wrists and a truth he couldn't unfeel. The car stopped. The metal door of the holding cell clanged shut behind him, a sound that asked no questions, a sound that didn't care. He paused in the doorway, adjusting to the stale air and fluorescent flicker overhead. The room was bare. Stained walls, one metal bench, no clock, no window, just concrete and waiting. No one had removed the cuffs. Or maybe they had chosen not to. He walked slowly to the bench and sat down. The cold metal pressed through his clothes, reminding him that comfort was not part of this equation. He leaned back, eyes blank, thoughts loud. This was the cost of being ordinary. He had thought it would feel freeing. He had been wrong. All it took was one wrong house, one fearful voice, one dead phone, and the illusion crumbled. The simplicity he once craved had betrayed him in the cruelest way. Now, seated in handcuffs in a forgotten room, stripped of the invisible armor that power usually wrapped around him, he felt small, smaller than he had in decades. Guilt seeped in uninvited, slow but unrelenting. Not guilt for wrongdoing, because he had done nothing wrong, but guilt for lowering his guard, for daring to believe, even briefly, that fairness might be returned if he extended it first. He had forgotten that no amount of dignity could shield a man when the world had already decided to fear his skin. His head leaned back against the cold wall, eyes open, dry, no tears. Just a heavy, quiet sorrow that settled beside him like a second body in the room. He wasn't angry. Not yet. Anger would come later. For now, there was something softer, more dangerous. Disappointment. Disappointment in the system, in the woman, in the neighbor's silence, but most of all, in the hope he had carried with him when he stepped off that plane. A fragile, foolish hope that being human might come before being judged. A muffled voice echoed from the hallway. Then nothing. He closed his eyes, not to sleep, but to retreat. He thought of Aisha, of her 3 newborns, likely crying, likely hungry. She must be wondering why he hadn't arrived. He imagined her standing at the window, waiting. He wondered how he'd ever explain this, if he even got the chance. He inhaled slowly, the cold air biting his lungs. And in that silence, he faced the truth he'd tried not to speak. They didn't see a man. They saw a color. And that had been enough. He didn't know how long he'd sat there when the memories began to rise, unwelcome, unstoppable. The cold of the bench had seeped deep into his bones, but that wasn't what made him shiver. It was the echoes, the voices, the crowds, the microphones, the speeches, the promises. He remembered Ouagadougou. Thousands had gathered under the sun, shoulder to shoulder, eyes turned toward him, faces lit with hope. He had stood tall, firm in his dark suit, hands open to the people and the world. He had spoken of unity, of dignity, of a Burkina Faso that would rise not through weapons, but through truth.
I told my people we were equals in the eyes of the world, he whispered to the empty room. The words hung there, fragile, hollow. He hadn't spoken them as theater. He had believed them deeply. That justice wasn't tied to geography, that humanity wasn't conditional, that if they built a better nation, the world would meet them with respect. But here he was, shackled in silence. Not for who he was, but for who they assumed he must be. The irony cut deep. He had spent years telling young boys that their skin wasn't a curse, their accent wasn't a flaw. He had promised mothers their children would be judged by their minds, not their appearance. He had said those words with conviction. And in 5 minutes, a woman's fear, a quiet neighborhood, and 2 uniforms trained to react, not to ask, and a man reduced to a silhouette. He shifted. The metal bit into his wrists again, red, bruised. He imagined the photo, a president in chains. But who would believe it? Who would even care? In this room, he wasn't a leader, not a guest, not even a man, just a shadow, too dark to recognize, too silent to remember. And that, he realized, was the most dangerous kind of erasure. Not the kind that kills the body, but the kind that deletes the truth while the world scrolls on. Blink, move on. He closed his eyes again, whispering softly to the walls, not seeking answers, but anchoring memory. I told them we were equals. And for the first time in years, he didn't know if he believed it anymore. As the sun climbed, Aisha began to worry. At first, it was just a glance at the clock, a slight furrow in her brow. He'd said he'd arrive in the morning, and the morning had nearly slipped into noon. She told herself not to overthink. Maybe there was traffic. Maybe he stopped for flowers. She wanted to believe that, because that was who he was, thoughtful, precise, never careless. But when she checked her phone for the 4th time in 15 minutes, no missed calls, no messages, no typing bubbles, doubt crept in louder. She stood in the living room, gently rocking one of the newborns, wrapped in a soft blue blanket. The baby cooed, unaware of the silence closing in. Her husband, Michael, entered from the kitchen with a bottle in hand. He paused. "He's still not here?" he asked. She shook her head. "Not even a message." Michael glanced at the clock. "What time did he leave the hotel?" 8, she said, lowering herself to the couch. "Maybe earlier." "He had the house number?" She nodded. "At least, I thought he did. He said he wanted it to be a surprise. Typical Ibrahim." Michael offered a half smile. It didn't hold. He sat beside her and took the baby from her arms. "Maybe his phone died." "Even then," Aisha said softly, "he would have borrowed someone's. He always has a plan. He doesn't just disappear." She wasn't panicking, not yet, but the unease had rooted itself quiet, persistent, heavy. Something wasn't right. Ibrahim was a man of discipline, a protector by nature. And now, silence. She scrolled through her phone again, rereading his last message. "See you in the morning. Don't tell the kids I'm coming." A smiling emoji. That was it. She stood and walked to the window. Outside, the neighborhood looked peaceful. Birds chirped, a dog barked. The sky was clear. Everything so normal it felt cruel. Still no call, still no sign. Michael joined her at the glass. "Maybe he took the wrong street. We can drive around, check the area." She shook her head. "If he got lost, he'd ask. He wouldn't just keep walking." Then, for the first time, she said it out loud. Ibrahim doesn't disappear. The baby stirred. The bottle sat forgotten. And the warmth in the room shifted, replaced now by something colder, a quiet dread. Somewhere out there, the man the world called Mr. President had vanished, and no one had the faintest idea where to begin looking. Inside the precinct, the air was thick with the scent of stale coffee, harsh disinfectant, and that deep fatigue that seeps into the walls of places built to hold silence and suspicion. It was a little after 7 p.m. when Daniel arrived for his shift, uniform a bit wrinkled, hair still damp from a rushed shower. 3 months into the job, he was still green, still cautious. His older colleagues had already numbed themselves into routine. Clock in, sign papers, ignore the noise from locked doors. But Daniel treated every shift like a pop quiz he hadn't studied for. He dropped his bag near the break room, nodded at a passing officer, and made his way to the control desk. "Anything new?" he asked. "Just a weirdo picked up for trespassing. No ID, acting off, probably faking it," someone muttered. Daniel barely reacted. He'd heard it all before. Still, something made him pause when he passed the corridor leading to the holding cells. Through the narrow glass window, he caught a glimpse of a man, sitting upright, hands folded, perfectly still. No shouting, no pacing, just stillness, like someone waiting not for release, but for recognition. From the angle Daniel stood, he could make out part of the man's face: dark skin, neatly groomed beard, clothes simple but deliberately chosen. Something about him didn't match the word trespasser. "Who's in cell 3?" Daniel asked a nearby officer. She didn't look up. "Guy was creeping around a gated community, said he was visiting family. No ID, no phone, didn't cooperate, so we cuffed him." "Did he give a name?" "Said something weird, claimed to be a diplomat or a politician. You know how they are, trying to sound important." "Anyone check?" She shrugged. "No ID, nothing to check." Daniel turned back to the glass. The man's expression hadn't changed, still composed, still waiting. Not like someone who had something to hide, but like someone who is used to not being believed. Most people in holding talked too much. This man had said nothing. And that, in itself, said everything. Daniel stared a moment longer. Then he reached for his keys and quietly opened the door. The metallic click echoed softly behind him as he stepped in. The man didn't look up at first. He sat as before, shoulders straight, hands on knees, the posture of someone used to carrying heavy things in silence. "Good evening," Daniel said, keeping his tone level, respectful. The man slowly lifted his gaze. His eyes were tired, but focused, calm, not afraid, the kind of calm that comes from living too long under judgment. There was a long pause. Then, for the first time, the man spoke. "You're the first person to ask." Daniel nodded, the weight of that sentence sinking deep into him. "May I have your name, sir?" The man hesitated, not as if he was hiding something, but as if he wasn't sure the name would matter here. Then he said it softly. "Ibrahim Traoré." Daniel blinked. The name sounded vaguely familiar. A headline, maybe. A news clip. He repeated it in his head, then stood abruptly. "I'll be right back." He crossed to the front desk, logged into the computer, and opened a browser. The results appeared in seconds, and Daniel froze. Dozens of images filled the screen. Podiums, state dinners, diplomatic visits. Headlines shouted the same title: President of Burkina Faso, youngest African head of state, vocal critic of neocolonialism, defender of sovereignty. Photos showed the same man from the cell, now in tailored suits, shaking hands with world leaders, speaking at the UN. Daniel felt his breath catch. It was him. It was really him. The man they labeled a trespasser. The man they cuffed without question. The man who sat in silence while everyone around him refused to see. He turned toward the desk where the female officer sat, scrolling her phone. "You said he made something up," she looked up. "Yeah, he said he was somebody important. They all do." "He is," Daniel said. "He's the president of Burkina Faso." Her face went blank. "Wait, what?" Daniel didn't answer. He didn't need to. The screen behind him said it all. And somewhere down the hall, behind a locked door, the truth had been sitting in silence, waiting for someone, anyone, to care enough to ask. Daniel's footsteps echoed as he moved fast down the corridor, keys trembling slightly in his hand, not from fear, but from the heavy clarity of realization. At the cell door he paused, took a breath, then turned the lock. The door opened slowly. Ibrahim looked up. No surprise, no resentment, just patience. The kind born from knowing that truth always arrives late and always tired. Daniel didn't sit this time. He stepped forward, like approaching something sacred and broken at the same time. "Sir," he said quietly, "I owe you an apology, a real one." Ibrahim nodded once, acknowledging the words. Daniel reached for the cuffs. His hands moved carefully, almost reverently. When the metal clicked open, the sound wasn't harsh. It was gentle, like a sigh of release. "There's been a terrible mistake," Daniel said. "I checked everything. You were telling the truth. All of it." He stopped himself. The rest didn't need to be said. Ibrahim rubbed his wrist slowly. The red marks were there, visible, but he didn't dwell on them. Instead, he looked at Daniel, quietly, directly, and said nothing. He didn't need to, because the weight of what had happened hung in the air. And Daniel understood. The world had misplaced a president, and in their rush to ignore him, they had missed something far more important: his humanity. "They didn't see a man," he said quietly. "They saw a threat." The words weren't loud. They carried no anger, but they landed with a weight Daniel couldn't shake. They didn't echo. They settled, like a verdict. "I believe you," Daniel said quickly, "and I swear I'll report this. I'll talk to the chief. This should have never—" "You don't need to explain," Ibrahim cut in gently. "I've lived this, just in different places, different languages." Daniel started to speak, then stopped. What could he possibly say? Nothing would undo what had been done. The man in front of him sat in a cell, humiliated in silence, not because he committed a crime, but because someone thought he didn't look right. Daniel's voice cracked. "No one even checked your name. No one listened. They just acted." He gave a small nod. "That's how it starts." No rage, no bitterness, just calm. And somehow that calm cut deeper than outrage. Daniel wished he'd yell, accuse, something to shift the weight, but Ibrahim's composure made it all undeniable, personal, shameful. "I never wanted to be treated like a president. I just didn't want to be treated like a problem." Daniel looked away, swallowing hard. "I'm sorry, sir. You're not the one who cuffed me, but you're the one who chose to see me." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Outside the station continued, phones ringing, doors opening. But inside that cell, time stood still, thick with silence, heavy with truth. Finally, Daniel said, "Let's get you out of here." Ibrahim stood slowly, still upright, and as they walked the corridor, the overhead lights, once sterile and cold, now seemed to burn with quiet shame. No alarms, no commotion, just two men, one still in uniform, the other still wearing invisible bruises. The station had never been loud, but that night's silence buzzed like static. Daniel barely reached the front desk before two senior officers looked up from casual conversation. "He's the president," Daniel said, breathless. "The man in cell 3?" one asked. "He's Ibrahim Traoré, president of Burkina Faso. I confirmed it. Photos, speeches, government pages. It's real." A pause, then skepticism. "Come on," one officer scoffed. "We get that all the time. Guys claiming to be UN staff, ministers, astronauts. It's a joke." "I'm not guessing," Daniel snapped. "I verified it. No name check, no ID confirmation. We cuffed a sitting president without even asking his name." Silence fell. Then panic began to ripple. One officer turned toward the phone already dialing. The other walked briskly toward the chief's office. Within 10 minutes, the station shifted. Doors opened faster. Footsteps grew hurried. Young officers crowded monitors, hunting for clips, anything to confirm the unbelievable. One found a UN speech. Another read a quote about African dignity and independence. Meanwhile, Ibrahim sat quietly in the lobby, still, composed. Daniel sat beside him, watching as the room fell apart around them. The man who had been ignored now held everyone's gaze, but nothing could undo what was done. One officer approached, visibly nervous, badge slightly crooked. "Sir, we deeply apologize. Protocol was followed. We didn't recognize." "I didn't ask to be recognized," Ibrahim said evenly. "I asked to be heard." The officer froze. Words fell short in the presence of such calm disappointment. Another came forward. "Mr. President, the chief will see you now. The mayor's office has been informed." Ibrahim stood. Around him, apologies floated like ash, plentiful but weightless. They had cuffed him without question. Now they stumbled over themselves in guilt. As he walked past, most avoided his eyes. One whispered, "How did this happen?" No one answered. Daniel followed closely. Before entering the chief's office, Ibrahim paused. He looked around, not at anyone, but at the building itself. Then he spoke, not loud, not bitter, just true. Respect built on recognition is not respect. It's fear in disguise. And then he stepped inside. It began with a single photo, grainy, likely taken by a junior officer. Ibrahim Traoré, seated in a holding cell, wrists cuffed, head slightly bowed. Not in shame, but in waiting. The image leaked around midnight, first to a small law enforcement forum. Then it hit Reddit, then Twitter, then everything. By morning, it was global. Hashtag President in Cuffs. Hashtag Ibrahim Traoré. Hashtag Not Just Another Black Man. Newsrooms scrambled. Journalists raced to confirm. But it was real and raw. This wasn't fiction, not a stunt. This was a sitting African president detained with no due process, misjudged because of how he looked. Anchors hesitated. Others dove in. How did this happen? What does this say about race, power, and perception? Pundits debated. Politicians issued soft statements. Activists roared. But through it all, the photo remained. One man, handcuffed, surrounded by a world that only saw his skin until the internet told him his name. Responses split like tectonic plates. "I'm ashamed. This should have never happened." "If this can happen to a president, what about the rest of us?" But not everyone reflected. Some dug in deeper. How were the cops supposed to know? No ID, walking around rich neighborhoods. This isn't about race. Stop making it about color." That comment, like a match dropped into dry grass, set everything ablaze. The internet became a battlefield, compassion against cynicism, lived reality clashing with willful ignorance. And as arguments flared, something unexpected happened. Stories began to pour in. From across the world, people shared their own experiences, stopped at gates, followed in stores, questioned for simply existing. Back at the station, the chief stared at his phone in disbelief. His inbox was flooded. National networks wanted interviews. International outlets demanded statements. Politicians called for accountability. The mayor's office scrambled to release a public apology within hours. "We regret the unfortunate treatment of President Ibrahim Traoré and reaffirm our commitment to dignity and mutual respect in our international relations." But instead of calming the fire, it fueled it. "Unfortunate treatment?" one user tweeted. "You cuffed a president because you was black. Say it." In the break room, Daniel sat motionless, eyes fixed on the muted TV screen. News tickers rolled across the bottom, but his mind was elsewhere. Just hours ago, it had been a quiet shift. Now it was a global reckoning. This wasn't about one misstep. It was about what that misstep exposed. And across the world, one question echoed. If a president can be reduced to a suspect in seconds, what chance does anyone else have? Ibrahim stayed silent through it all. He didn't read headlines, didn't watch broadcasts. He didn't need to. He'd lived the truth long before it became a trending topic. The world was finally watching. But whether it would remember, that was another matter. Near the station exit, Daniel stood with his hands clasped, waiting. The chaos had quieted, but the air was still thick, the kind of silence that follows something irreversible. As Ibrahim prepared to leave, Daniel stepped forward. His voice was softer now, stripped of formality. "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry. Not just for the handcuffs, but for everything. For not seeing you sooner. For being part of a system that didn't even ask your name." Ibrahim turned. His face was calm, unreadable. "I know you are." A pause. "And I forgive you." Daniel exhaled, but the relief was short-lived. "Forgiveness," Ibrahim continued, "doesn't mean forgetting, and it doesn't mean silence, because silence is complicity." Daniel nodded slowly. "You're right." As Ibrahim walked past him, his words lingered like smoke that wouldn't clear. He wasn't angry, he was awake, and now so was the world. Outside, the evening light had softened, painting the pavement gold. A black car waited at the curb. Aisha stood beside it, her 3 children wrapped against her chest. Her husband, Michael, paced nervously. When she saw him emerge from the station, a sound escaped her lips, a gasp that was half sob, half laughter. "Ibrahim!" she called out. She ran to him, tears already falling. He opened his arms and she collapsed into them. "You scared me," she whispered against his chest. "We didn't know what to think." "I'm here," he murmured, resting one hand on her back. Michael joined them, gripping Ibrahim's shoulder. "They told us nothing. We kept calling. We never stopped." Ibrahim looked down at the children, innocent, unaware of the weight of the world they were born into. He smiled faintly. "They're more beautiful than I imagined." The moment was tender, but not light. Behind the relief was something unspoken. They all knew this could have ended differently. Isa looked up at him. "Are you okay?" He hesitated. Physically, yes, but inside,
He paused. "I've stood before world leaders, debated policy, fought for justice. But today, one woman with a phone and a pointed finger had more power than all of that." She didn't reply. She just took his hand. He squeezed it gently. Forgiveness, but never forgetting. Because forgetting meant it could happen again. And some truths must be remembered, loudly and without apology. The plane touched down just after noon under a pale, hazy sky. No cameras, no crowds, no national anthem. Just the low drone of engines and the soft thud of wheels meeting runway. President Ibrahim Traoré stepped onto the stairs. No luggage, only a slim black folder under one arm and the weight of the last 48 hours on his shoulders. The air in Burkina Faso felt different. Not just warmer, familiar. It wrapped around him like home. But comfort was not waiting at the bottom of the stairs. 3 of his personal guards stood in a neat row, suits sharp, faces strained. Their stillness wasn't protocol, it was restraint. "Welcome back, sir," the youngest said, trying to steady his voice. Ibrahim nodded, unreadable. The older guard, blunt as always, shook his head slowly. "Sir, we all told you, not to go alone." "You did," Ibrahim said quietly. "No offense, but you're the president of a nation. You don't have the luxury of being just a man, not even for 2 days. And now, look!" "I know what happened," Ibrahim said, and though his tone was soft, the words landed like steel. The conversation stopped cold. The guards hadn't failed him. He had chosen to walk alone, and in doing so, he had exposed the raw truth, that outside of titles and offices, the world still judged by skin. "You just wanted to breathe," the youngest said quietly. "But they didn't let you." "No," Ibrahim said, his eyes fixed on the open stretch of runway ahead. "They didn't let me forget who I am or what I represent." The guards lowered their heads. They had seen the reports, watched the footage, heard the outrage flood in from around the world. But none of that changed the simplest, harshest truth. The man they were sworn to protect had been treated like a criminal for existing in the wrong skin, at the wrong place, at the wrong time. "We're sorry, sir," the eldest finally said. Ibrahim turned. His expression softened, but his voice carried weight. "Don't apologize for what they did. Just promise me something." They straightened, instinctively. "Never let their fear of our skin become the reason we fear ourselves. We carry more than a flag. We carry proof that dignity doesn't need permission." The words landed deep. No one spoke. Then they turned toward the waiting car under the neem trees. Ibrahim didn't look back at the plane. There was nothing for him behind that flight, only the road ahead. The guest room was quiet and dim. Curtains drifted gently with the midnight breeze, casting slow-moving shadows across the walls. Outside, the neighborhood slept peacefully, unaware that behind one silent window, a man who had once stood before nations now sat on the edge of a borrowed bed, his hands clasped, shoulders low, not from duty, but from something heavier. Down the hall a baby whimpered. Isa's voice whispered in response, soft and soothing. Life went on, but Ibrahim's thoughts didn't. The door creaked. Michael stood there, in an old t-shirt and a look of worry. "You mind if I come in?" Ibrahim nodded faintly. Michael dragged a chair near the window. He didn't speak right away. Neither did Ibrahim. Just the ticking of the clock, crickets chirping outside. Then, finally, "You've barely said a word since dinner," Michael said. "Even the kids couldn't pull more than a half smile from you." Ibrahim exhaled, not annoyed, just tired. "I don't know what to say that hasn't already been said, or ignored." Michael leaned forward. "Then don't say it for them, say it for you. I'm not a reporter. I'm not a headline. I'm your cousin. I'm here." Ibrahim looked up. His eyes glinted in the low light. "I knew racism existed. I've seen it in laws, in boardrooms, in the cold smiles of diplomats who shake your hand but never see you. But this?" He paused, struggling with the weight behind the words. "This was different. A woman looked at me and decided I was dangerous before I could say a word." Michael's jaw tightened. "Because to her, your skin shouted louder than your voice ever could." Ibrahim nodded, eyes closing for a moment. "All I wanted was 2 days to breathe. No guards, no salutes, just to feel human. But for daring to walk down a quiet street, I was treated like a threat, like a shadow the world was eager to erase." Michael didn't respond. He just let the silence hold the truth. Sometimes silence is the only thing strong enough to carry the truth. Ibrahim spoke again, voice low. "I didn't fight back. Not because I wasn't angry, but because I knew. If I resisted, they'd say I was dangerous. If I flinched, I might not be here talking to you." Michael whispered, "And still they feared you even in stillness." Ibrahim let out a dry, tired smile. "That's the cruelest irony, to be feared, even in peace." They sat in that shared understanding, two men bound by blood and a history too painful to retell and too important to forget. After a long pause, Michael said, "The world's listening now, whether they like it or not. You have their attention." Ibrahim nodded. "Then maybe it's time I give them something worth remembering." And somewhere inside, the man the world tried to silence began shaping the words that would make it see. The sun had just begun to rise over the Capitol, casting a dull orange glow across the presidential courtyard. The trees stood still, and the rare coolness of morning settled over the land. Ibrahim stood alone near the front gate, hands clasped behind his back, breathing in slowly like a man returning from a war only he could see. His guards approached, 3 men in black suits, trained to detect threats. But today their expressions held something else. Not vigilance, not pride, shame. The eldest stepped forward. "Sir, may I speak freely?" Ibrahim didn't turn, just nodded. "We failed you. We should have insisted on going. We should have been there." Another spoke, voice heavy with guilt. "We didn't just fail to protect you, we let the world humiliate you. And us." Ibrahim turned, slow and steady. His face was calm, but his eyes burned, not with rage, but with truth. "You think this is about me being alone?" The guards fell silent. "It's not. What happened wasn't your failure. It wasn't even mine. It was a mirror, a reflection of how deep this sickness runs, how quickly the world chooses to judge a face before it hears a voice." They shifted, visibly affected. Ibrahim stepped closer, his voice firmer now. Don't ever judge yourself by how they see us. Don't wear their fear like it belongs to you. A beat of silence. Then, we are not what they fear, he said. We are what they refuse to understand. And the words hung in the air, truths too heavy to ignore, too loud to forget. We are who we choose to be, he said softly. Whether they see our humanity or not, we must never stop living with it. A deep silence followed, not empty but full, the kind of silence that settles after something true has been spoken. He looked past the guards toward the horizon, where the first light of morning broke open the sky. They saw me as a threat, not because of what I did, but because of how I looked. They ignored my name, my posture, my peace. They saw only a story they'd already been told, about people who look like me. One of the younger guards murmured, and they didn't care if it was true. Ibrahim nodded. No, but we don't fix that by shouting or by shrinking. We fix it by living, by existing with dignity, by refusing to let their assumptions become our truth. He paused. Every time we enter a room with our heads held high, we rewrite their narrative. Every time we choose grace over rage, strength over silence, we remind them our worth isn't up for debate. The guard stood straighter now. It wasn't that their shame had vanished. It had transformed into something stronger. Resolve. Thank you, sir, one finally said. Ibrahim gave a faint smile. I needed to hear it too. As the sun climbed higher over the palace and city beyond, the man once handcuffed for the color of his skin stood cloaked in something that no law, no ignorance could touch: dignity. The press room was full. You could hear a breath drop. Cameras adjusted, notepads flipped open, rows of microphones glinted under sterile lights. Then he entered. No entourage, no papers, no teleprompter, just President Ibrahim Traoré, calm, steady, standing alone. He waited a moment before he spoke. Good afternoon. His voice was quiet, but it carried, not just through the room, but into every corner of a world watching. You already know why I'm here. This is not about policy, not about treaties, not even about power. This is about something older, deeper, more dangerous than any weapon I've ever seen. He let the silence speak for a breath. Prejudice. It landed like stone. 2 days ago, someone called the police, not because of what I did, but because of what I looked like. To them, I wasn't a president. I wasn't even a man. I was a threat wrapped in human skin. For hours, no one asked my name, because my skin had already answered for me. He didn't need to shout. Each word carved its way through the room. I'm not here to shame a nation. I'm not angry at individuals, but I am disappointed in a system where fear trumps fact, where silence smothers truth, where humanity must earn its own dignity. He stepped away from the podium, walked slowly, then turned back. I've stood in war zones, sat across from those who swore peace was impossible, but nothing has ever made me feel more invisible than being judged before I even spoke. Some in the crowd lowered their gazes, others blinked back emotion. I won't press charges, because what I want isn't punishment, it's progress. The room stirred. I stand here today not as a victim, not just as a leader, but as a reminder. No title, no wealth,
No success will ever be enough if the first thing they see is your skin. He leaned forward. If it can happen to me, imagine how often it happens to those with no platform, no camera, no one to believe them. A pause. Then quieter, but sharper. We're not asking for special treatment, just not to be treated like exceptions. We're asking to be seen. The air froze. Then he said the words that would echo far beyond that room. Dignity should not be something we have to earn. And with that, he stepped away. Outside, the cameras were gone. The crowd had thinned. Reporters raced to file headlines, edit footage, shape the moment into sound bites. But Ibrahim Traoré sat quietly on a bench in the palace gardens, the sun sinking behind the tamarind trees. Here there was no cell, no spotlight, just stillness and truth. Somewhere inside, Aisha's children laughed. Their joy spilled out like sunlight. He smiled faintly. For all the battles he had fought, on podiums and in back rooms, he hadn't expected one of his most defining moments to come in handcuffs. A young aide approached, holding a folder. "Sir, the press requests, CNN, Al Jazeera, everyone wants more." He didn't reach for it, just looked at it, then away. "Let them write what they want," he said. "The story's already been told." The aide hesitated. "Ignore them?" Abraham shook his head. "No. Just don't chase noise. Truth doesn't need to shout to be heard." The aide nodded and left. Abraham leaned back, eyes closed. He could have turned this into outrage, could have demanded apologies, sparked boycotts, stoked fury. But that would only feed the same system that fed on fear. He didn't want outrage. He wanted reflection. Because the power of the moment wasn't in its scandal. It was in its clarity, the kind that comes when you're seen not as a president, not as a problem, but as a person. The garden door opened again. Michael walked out with a cup of tea and an old book, sat beside him. "Still thinking about it?" "I don't think it'll ever leave," Abraham replied. "Not the incident. What it meant." Michael nodded. "Maybe that's the point." They sipped tea in silence, listening to crickets and laughter. Then Abraham said quietly, "This won't make me a hero. It shouldn't. I didn't escape war. I didn't survive death. I just got stopped for walking." Michael tilted his head. "But maybe choosing to keep walking after that. Maybe that says something." Abraham smiled. "Maybe." He stood, brushing the dust from his pants. "This isn't my story, not just mine. I want people to remember. Behind every skin tone is a heart. Behind every headline, a human." As he walked back inside, his shadow stretched long behind him, but it didn't follow. It simply stayed behind, etched in earth. Not a wound, but a reminder. That night, Abraham stood by the window, watching the tamarind tree sway in the wind. Scarred, rooted, still reaching skyward. He thought of that woman, her voice, her fear. The silence of the crowd, the cold steel of the cuffs. He thought of Daniel, of Aisha, of the nameless millions whose stories echoed in his. He whispered, barely audible. One tree is not a forest. One woman's fear is not the world. And one mistake must not define a people. He closed the curtain, turned off the light, and let the night hold him, not as a leader, not as a symbol, but as a man who chose not to carry hate forward. Because dignity doesn't need a spotlight. It just needs to be remembered. If this story moved you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to Joe Justice Stories, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a dramatized fictional narrative, inspired by real issues and lived truths. While characters and events are imagined, the emotions and injustices they reflect are deeply real. We aim not to sensationalize, but to stir thought, compassion, and conversation. Thank you for listening.